It's been our tradition for the last several years to hold a dialogue on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with Rabbi Feinstein. And this year, for our text, we selected yesterday's Torah reading. So if you'd like to follow along, you can turn to page 202. Page 202. If I were a betting man, I'd bet that next year we'll do second day Torah reading. So why did we pick yesterday's Torah reading? Well, for me, and I actually think for the tradition, the selection of yesterday's Torah reading that we read about Abraham and Sarah and the birth of Isaac is actually a surprising one if we think that what yesterday celebrates is the birthday of the world. If we're talking about the birthday of the world, then there's actually a text that talks about the birthday of the world. It's chapter 1 of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, right? In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. But instead, we opened the Torah on day 1 Rosh Hashanah, after the apples and honey, and after the circular chalot, and all of the other symbols that we use to reference the world and creation. We have Va'adonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar. And God took note of Sarah. God remembered Sarah as God had said, or here promised. And we're supposed to think to ourselves, what? What? I mean, if you're paying attention during the shofar blast, and I just turned the page so I don't have it, Hayom Harat Olam is translated as today is the birthday of the world. That's the English reading that we just did just several minutes ago. And I stand here to tell you, Hayom Harat Olam does not mean today is the birthday of the world. That the Torah reading is actually much more in keeping with what the day is supposed to represent. Hayom Harat Olam means today the world stands pregnant, poised with possibility. And the Torah reading reflects the first Jewish pregnancy with possibility. The transmission of our covenant could not have occurred without this pregnancy. And if you're reading up until this point and you think to yourself, well, there was a pregnancy that could produce the transmission of the covenant, then you're clearly mistaken. The rabbis in the Talmud have this conversation. The conversation happens in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. I'm at the very bottom of 10b if you're holding a Masechet in your pocket and you want to open and follow along. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer. So a bright text from another source. Rabbi Eliezer says, in Tishrei, the world was created. In Tishrei, the patriarchs were all born. In Tishrei, the patriarchs all died. On Passover, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashanah, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were all remembered by God and conceived. On Rosh Hashanah, Joseph came out of prison. On Rosh Hashanah, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased. In Nisan, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And in Tishrei, in the future, the Jewish people will be redeemed once again. Rabbi Yeshua Omer. Then Rabbi Yeshua comes along and offers his teaching. And the teaching says, I disagree. In Nisan, the world was created. That you didn't learn in religious school growing up. The world was born on Nisan. In Nisan, the patriarchs were born. In Nisan, the patriarchs died. And now we get to the crux of what they agree on. This is what overlaps between their two teachings. On Passover, Isaac was born, which means on what day was he conceived, if we're all relatively good at math. If he was born in the springtime, he was conceived on Rosh Hashanah. Don't do the math too hard. It doesn't... On Rosh Hashanah, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were all remembered by God. On Rosh Hashanah, Joseph came out from prison. On Rosh Hashanah, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased because the plagues began, and then on Nisan, we were redeemed. This is couched here in the Parsha that we read and in the teachings of the rabbis in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. This is a day upon which Jewish dreams come true. If there are 2 days on which Jewish dreams come true, one is Rosh Hashanah and the other is Passover. Thank you for following along, Elaine Gill. You get an extra bagel at Kiddush come Shabbos. And so the framing of this holiday, even though the liturgy begins in the Shachrit Amidah one way, the Torah reading pulls it in this direction to reframe it, to explain the holiday is not about the world per se, the birthday of the world, but rather what we can do inside of that world.
I have another surprise. I'll answer his question later. I have another surprise. It's all about women. All the readings are about women. First, you start with Mother Sarah, who conceives a child at 90. Don't try this at home. And then there's an issue with the other mother, Hagar, and the conflict between the two of them. And we hear the voice of Sarah, and we hear the voice of Hagar. And then you turn to the Haftorah, the prophetic section that is assigned to this holiday. Yesterday, the Haftorah is all about the birth of Samuel, the prophet, and his mother Hannah, and her sister Penina, and Hannah as the mother longing to have a child. And then you turn to the Haftorah that we read today, which is the Haftorah of Yirmiyahu, and you read about Rachel, who was, remember, she died on the way into Eretz Canaan, on the way home from Mesopotamia, and she's there on the edge of the road, and as the people Israel are going into exile, she cries for her children. So we have Sarah, and we have Hagar, and we have Hannah, and we have Rachel, and there's one more which is a little subtle, but there is a story later in the Tanakh about the great judge, the prophetess and judge Devorah, and her hero Barak, and they defeat a Canaanite king. And the Canaanite king's general is a guy named Sisera, and he dies a miserable death. You don't want to know from this. But the poem of that event talks about his mother waiting at the door, waiting at the window for the son who is delayed in coming back, and her cries, and the tradition attached her cries to the sound of the shofar. So the sound of the shofar is the cry of a bereft mother. And the sound of the Torah reading is the sound of a mother weeping for her child. Sarah, who is infertile and waiting for a child. Hannah, who is infertile and waiting for a child. And Rachel, who is a mother who had children only late in her life, seeing her children go into exile. And all of the tears of all of these mothers. Oh yes, and there's one more story, which we'll get to next year, which is today's story. That Abraham takes his son to the top of a mountain to sacrifice him to a god. And guess who's missing from that story? Sarah's missing from that story. Nowhere does she appear in the story. There is a midrash that points out that in the next story in the Torah, she dies. And so the story is that an angel, or rather a devil, came and said to her, "You know where your husband went." And when she finds out what he went to do, she can't live in the world with him anymore. And she dies. And so what we have here is a very interesting story of a contrast between two models of spirituality. One we could call a masculine spirituality, and one which is a feminine spirituality. And the masculine spirituality takes a kid to the top of the hill in order to kill him in worship of his God. And I've asked this question 1,000 times to 1,000 different classes. If God had come to Sarah and said, take your son, your only one, the one you love, to Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice, what would Sarah have said? Yes, exactly right. I've never met an audience that didn't say exactly like, what? Because there's a difference in the way that we relate to the world. Now, it's not male, female. It's a model. And what the Torah is what the rabbis did in putting these readings up is to contrast the two models for a very simple reason. What are we asking for? What are we asking for on this holiday? The tradition imagines that God has two thrones and two crowns. One is the throne of din, of justice, of judgment, and the crown of judgment. And with that, God judges the world, metes out punishment. And the other is the throne of rachamim, of mercy. And with that, God is gentle, and God forgives, and God gives second chances. And the word rachamim is associated in the tradition with rechem, which means womb. In other words, what we are praying for is that God move from God's masculine side to God's feminine side and love us with the love of a mother who forgives and who loves and who is gentle and who cares and is willing to give us a second chance. And that brings all the Torah readings together.
So Rabbi Feinstein is right. It is all about women. He's usually right. The themes of the creation of the world, creation itself, is a feminine theme. The move from being barren to being fertile, nature, children, relationships, these are all usually associated with feminine themes in the tradition. But the creation of the world only occurs once. And I would argue the rabbis are relatively less interested in the singular creation of the world. What we're interested in more is how do we recreate a better world over and over and over again. And I don't know if this happened in your house, but I'm certainly going to talk about my house for a minute in this recreation process. But in referencing whether Sarah would have disobeyed God, not taken Isaac up to the mountain, everybody resounding, no, she would not have. You already knew that walking in. There's no reason to teach you that. There's no reason to teach you that. I never I never thought growing up that my mother would kill me. Never. But I have to tell you, it's his birthday and he's right back there. There were moments where I thought I might not survive because my father had come home. And I have to tell you that if you're going to teach a lesson to a community that shows up on an important day, if you're going to gather them together, what a waste of a lesson it would be to say, Sarah loves her son more than anything and she would never hurt him. That doesn't teach us very much. We all knew that walking in. Mark Bretler, the Bible scholar, teaches that Abraham's life is divided into 7 chapters of 25 years. And for the first 3 of them, they're in Haran, they're in Mesopotamia. And he is maybe married. For some of them, he is accumulating wealth and beginning a career. And in the last 3 after Isaac's birth, we are exposed to a lot of his business deals. He becomes incredibly wealthy and powerful, pays for things, takes care of things. But in the middle 25 years, in the very middle of the chapter of his life, that's the middle 25 years that we're most concerned about, between age 76 and 101. And he is actually remembered for that 25 years when we know very little about what he did for a living outside of shepherd. What a wonderful message. What a wonderful message for us when we come in the one day of the year. To love our kids and to remember that no matter how successful or unsuccessful we are in our careers, on the day when people eulogize us, it won't matter. That's not what we're being remembered for. That's not how we impact the world. That's not how we recreate the world. Resources are very important to the show. All you have to see is my appeal yesterday. But what's more important for the sake of all of us in this world is raising mensches and trying our best not to kill them as we do it. It's important to talk about a mother's love. It's really important. But everybody who's married to an amazing woman, all of us know that that's just part of it. If you've ever tried raising children, husbands sometimes can fly off the handle at the smallest of things. And Lebovitz is even more so. And so, to remind us on Rosh Hashanah that the greatest accomplishment in recreating the world and refashioning it anew with a greater sense of justice and a greater sense of compassion, a greater sense of wisdom, a greater sense of loyalty, a greater sense of kinship to everybody around you is actually, it begins in your own personal home, at your dinner table, at your Shabbos table. And this story then gives birth to the tradition that lives, that dwells in your house, rather than exclusively the one that lives here in the sanctuary.
I forgot to answer his question. I better answer his question. Why isn't the Torah reading Breshit? Why isn't the Torah reading Genesis 1? I'll tell you why, I think. Genesis 1 is about the creation of the natural world, nature. And the Jewish people asked a very profound question. How do you tell time? How do you conceive of time? For most of human civilization, nature was the model. We conceived of time as nature. All of the ancient pagan civilizations conceived that nature is the paradigm for time, for history, for human experience. The problem with this is that time, in nature, time is circular. Day follows night, follows day, follows night. Winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. It's circular. It's a circular. Joseph Campbell once pointed out that the circle is the most powerful, popular symbol of existence in all of religious life. It's the most popular religious symbol. Christians conceive of their angels, their saints, with circular halos, and the Christian story is a circular story of the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of the God. Buddhists have prayer wheels. Native Americans build their villages in circles. It's all about circles. And circles invite you to imagine that death isn't real. Because as the phoenix, it is born, it grows, it matures, it dies, and then is resurrected. And the promise that death is not real, it's all a great circle. The great Mandela, history repeats itself, that great philosophy. And there's something deeply comforting in that philosophy because it understands that there's no ends, there's only new beginnings. And that every end, every death, every termination, it fertilizes the new beginning. That's why so many religious cultures worship in circles. But there's one small problem with circles. The problem with circles was pointed out in the first chapter of the book of Kohelet that we'll read on Sukkot, the book of Ecclesiastes. If all of life is a circle, if time is a circle, if experience is a circle, if history is a circle, there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything, says Kohelet, that anyone thinks of, somebody thought of it before. Every idea that's ever been raised matures in the world and dies, and someone else shows up tomorrow and says, I thought of something new. It's the same. Imagine kids down at the beach, and you watch them for a day, and they come early in the morning, and they build sandcastles and roads and turrets and all sorts of cities out of sand, and then 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the tide comes in and washes it away. And the next day, more kids come down, and they build whole civilizations on the sand, and then the tide comes in and washes it away, and by the third day, you understand Kohelet. If time is a circle, then there's no novelty, no invention. If time is a circle, then we're trapped, destined to repeat all of the mistakes of the past again and again and again. It's the twilight zone. So the Jewish people arrived at the most remarkable idea. You can conceive of time as a circle for nature. As a natural creature, I live in circles. And yet, as a moral creature, I live on a line. And the most powerful metaphor, the metaphor that is the gripping metaphor of the entire Torah, is a journey. History is not a circle, it's a journey from the house of bondage to the promised land. History is a journey from a place of oppression to a place of freedom and promise. History is a journey, and as long as I'm on the journey, there is progress and there is regress. And as long as I'm on the journey, I can make a contribution to go a little forward in this history. And as long as there's a history as a line, history as a journey, I can look forward to an end. It won't come in my lifetime, or maybe even the lifetime of my children, but it's there and I believe in it. Ani ma'amim be'emunah shlema. I believe in that end. And most of all, if time is a circle, then no individual exists. I mean, after all, in nature, there's no such thing as an ant. When they show up in my kitchen, it's in big tribes and mishpochas. Sure, it's birth, growth, decay, and death, and then rebirth. Rebirth of the species, not rebirth of the individual. But as an individual, what is the worth of my existence? Only if I conceive of time as a line and history as a journey do I exist as an individual, and can my contributions count, and can somebody say, yes, I remember her, I remember him, this is what they taught me, and this is what they gave me. This was the great revolution of the Jewish people and its contribution to human consciousness. And the rabbis understood this implicitly. So they didn't give us the beginning of circular time in Genesis. They gave us the beginning of historical time here with the birth of Isaac, with the next generation of the community, carrying forward, getting a little closer, a step closer to the great dream that God gave us to make real in the world. And each of us, as we begin this holiday together, you're not stuck. You're not stuck in who you were yesterday. You're not stuck in what you were yesterday. You're not determined by your parents or by the society around you. You have the eminent freedom to take a step forward in your life, and the entire possibility of taking a step backwards. And the question of the holiday is, which way are you going? And how will you get there? And who will you carry along with you? And so they gave us the beginning of history, not the beginning of nature. History, a step forward to something better for us all. No, that's it. I'm done. I can do another one.
So I want to end with this very silly idea, because this is what Rosh Hashanah is. according to the Talmud. Rosh Hashanah b'Tishrei nifkada Sarah. Imagine if we had birthday cakes. We gather our children together, and we all sing, "Happy conception to you, happy conception to you." That'd be really embarrassing. What are we remembering today? What is Rosh Hashanah supposed to be according to the rabbis? It's not the day that Isaac was born. The rabbis agree that happens in Nisan. This is the day that a 100-year-old and a 90-year-old decided to not give up. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Because my kids are in the room, I don't want to spell it out any more than that. A 100-year-old and a 90-year-old refused to give up. Because, I would argue, the world depended on it. Their sense of hope and their sense of optimism. Their resilience and strength. It rested on their idea that they could conceive in their minds and bodies of a future that was different of the one than the kids that they saw running around in the neighborhood. And I would argue that each Rosh Hashanah, when we get together, just like Rabbi Feinstein said about the circle versus the line, each Rosh Hashanah, when we get together, what we do when we come into this room is that we dream about how it is that we're going to raise ourselves and our children to be the best that they can be. To conceive, to innovate, to ideate, to innovate, that is the meaning of this holiday. And if you want to really celebrate when you get home, you can sing the Happy Conception song too. Shana Tova.